Hi, this is Naomi with Sword and Steel, and today we are going to be restoring this Bulbasaur figurine. And at the same time, I'm just going to give you some tips on how to color match for your own projects. So I hope you enjoy. Before we get started though, I just wanted to say thank you to the YouTube members and patrons that support this channel. There would be no way I could keep this going without your support, so I really appreciate it. And if after this video you might consider becoming a patron yourself, any information you need for that is in the description. Okay, let's get started.
So this Bulbasaur is actually in relatively fine shape in my opinion, but you can see a few places where the paint is scuffed off, and that is what we're going to fix. I won't be adding any extra details or highlights or shadows. I'm just going to be mixing the colors to the exact shade of the original and restoring it good as new. I hope you find my tips to color matching useful for your own projects. So here he is again after I've given him a little bit of a bath and applied a satin varnish all over him and let that varnish cure for about 48 hours before I touch them again. The varnish will allow my acrylic paints to stick to him as if he were primed. This will keep the paint from slipping off him easily when scuffed again, and slipping off in general, as paint does not adhere to all surfaces. So you should always try for some kind of primer first, and this varnish acts as an invisible primer. Now, when looking for a color match, this is where an enormous selection of paints will do you good. You can indeed mix basic colors together to locate that perfect shade that you want, but that wastes so much time and paint in your search. What you want to do is find the paint that most closely matches the color you are looking for already, so that you need only make a minor adjustment to it. And find all of the colors you need at the one go. If you're mimicking someone else's work, there's a good chance that one of the colors you pick out for one target might just have been used to mix the other, particularly if what you are mimicking is someone else's paint scheme as opposed to something digitally rendered. So with these likely candidates, I'm ready to go. I prepped a wet palette. Now this wet palette is the Army Painters Wargamers Edition wet palette. Works great. A wet palette is a must. It's a must for me anyway, because you don't want your mix to dry out before you're done with it, and you don't want to have to mix more than once if you can help it. And now we are going to find the light turquoise of Bulbasaur's skin. The color I found to be closest from what I had, and also has great opacity, was this Army Painter Fanatic Aqua Alchemy. Now, I know from a glance that this is actually a little too dark, even though it matches really closely in the bottle, but wet paint almost always dries darker than when it is wet. So I also have this marine mist to add to it to lighten it up a little, but I can see that this is a little bluer than I will want. So I'm also going to have this model color lime green to give it back a tint of green, and this heavy black green, which I don't think I'll need to use for this particular color, but I want it on the palette just in case. And I could do that with a wet palette. And I'm not going to get this correct on the first try, possibly, but with a little working, with trying it on the bottom of him so that when it dries, if I don't see it, I know I've got the right color, and I can always wipe off the mistakes. That's another thing that a satin varnish can help with. If you varnish the original paint scheme first, then you can wipe off any fresh paint and leave the old stuff there to keep testing your fresh paint on it with, which is what I was doing. Finally, I got the exact shade so that you cannot tell where the plastic ends and the paint begins on this model. So that is perfect. But as you can tell, it looks paler. Most every single paint will look lighter in color and will only match when it's dry. It'll be the same hue, but it'll look a little lighter. Okay, so that was the turquoise, and I very carefully apply it. Now the brush that I'm using, I wanted a brush that has very fine bristles so that I didn't have to worry about brush strokes. And another great thing about the palette is that it will naturally thin out your paints just a little bit so that you can apply it nice and carefully across a miniature without worrying about brush strokes, but I do have a medium close by if I needed to thin it down further, but it's working just fine the way it is. I did have the wet palette a little wetter than I normally do, and it's very humid right now. So after the turquoise had dried, it's time for me to go on to the darker turquoise patches on his skin, which at a glance you would think is the heavy black-green game color paint, but I felt that it was, again, a little too dark alone, so I added in the Aqua Alchemy to lighten it up a bit. Now, this one, I feel like, though I also matched it quite well, since the patches are separate from one another and easy to cover in the one go, if you were a little off with color matching for these separate areas, it would be quite forgiving. And I noticed that some of these little patches weren't quite covering the outlined area on the model itself, either because the original model had been painted with some flaws, which is likely from something factory produced, or because the paint was wearing off. I'm not sure. Either way, I made sure to more accurately apply the patches. And if I do happen to go over the edge, the wet palette has my pale skin color, which, like I mentioned, has great opacity, so cleaning up any mistakes is a breeze. I will tell you that doing these patches accurately on such a small miniature while keeping the mini under the camera so you can see what I'm doing is not the best practice for accuracy. Gotta say, that was difficult. So bear that in mind as I struggle to make sure you see even more than what I see. After I finished all the patches, it's time to paint his green bulb. So I start mixing Vallejo Model Color Lime Green with the Vallejo Game Heavy Black Green. And I can tell on the palette that it's a little too forest green for what I need, but I apply a little patch onto his bulb anyway so I can better see where I need to take the color. And then I just wash it off again before I go grab another color to mix into it. And besides adding Army Painter Fanatic Matte White to the palette now, as white can both pale and desaturate a color if need be, I also add Vallejo's Game Color Cayman Green, which will counter the more forest green in the mix. And then, with a little working and a few quick tests that I don't bother to remove because I'm just applying a paint right over it while the color underneath is still wet, I find a color I'm happy with and apply that entirely over the bulb, following the curves of the bulb so any brush strokes are hidden, and I'll go back with a thinner brush to get underneath. I should stress how important it is to have a flowing paint, not a liquid paint. You need some resistance, otherwise you're going to get that paint to spill outside of where you want it to go. But too thick of a paint and you'll add too thick of a coat, which will also be hard to hide brush strokes. You also, like I will repeat, want to find a paint that has a good opacity to work with. Less important for something with just a single color on each surface like this Pokemon is, but if you're dealing with a color gradient that you have to match, where, for example, a yellow becomes an orange, becomes a red, and you need to match that change, a paint with greater opacity means less layers to achieve that effect. And less layers is important to hide any evidence that you ever added paint to the model at all. Here, for example, I added some speed paint medium to my Fanatic White because I'm using a finer brush and the paint in smaller quantities will dry faster on your brush. So thinning it down with this medium or any medium like an express paint medium, contrast medium, that sort of thing, glaze medium, will allow me to brush it across the surface more easily from a brush since it also has flow improver in it. One of the reasons it's better than water. And it'll let me work with the paint a little longer before it dries on this detail brush, which small quantities of paint do. The last color that I have to figure out is the red of his eyes, and for this one, I am taking a little artistic liberty here. I find that his eyes are a little duller of a red than what they should be, so I am going to match the color, but give it a little more saturation. In the end, it should look just the same as before overall, but just a tiny bit brighter, more redder, which I think is what it was meant to be, being someone who has observed the Bulbasaur in his natural environment. So the colors I'm using for this are Basilisk Red from the Fanatic range again, and Express Color Velvet Red from the Vallejo Express Paints range. If you ever want to increase the saturation of a color, I do suggest trying these contrast paints, speed paints, or express paints out because some of them are so vibrant, they are perfect for mixing without having to use any great amount of them at all. And you can mix them into airbrush paints or hand paints alike. They will actually help an airbrush paint flow rather than hinder it. I should also stress at this point, as you see me fix a mistake I made with the red, that you really do want to make more of the mixes than you think you are going to need just for fixing mistakes. Because I'm not saying you are going to make mistakes, but just in case the doorbell rings and you get startled, the cat jumps onto the desk without warning, or your hand shakes a little because you are trying to make a smooth line with your brush, having extra mix for your mistakes is better than not. And after the red is done, he is complete. Except I also added a satin gloss varnish over him to bring back the original sheen the model had and to seal in all the colors so he will last longer without having to be fixed up in the future. Now, let's see how I did. I've already sent photos of him completed to the person I did this for, and she is thrilled with the work. So, job well done. This piece is quite sentimental to her, so I was happy to work on it and bring him back to new. I hope they have a great rest of their life together. Farewell, Bulbasaur.
Thanks for watching. Make certain if you like the video, like the video. It helps the video get spread for me. So do that for me if you have stayed all the way to the end. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, consider subscribing because I'm going to be putting all sorts of different paint videos out. And I will catch you in the next video. Bye!
I originally wanted to do some of the filming outside, but it was just too windy. Maybe next time.